All right, hi everyone. My name is Madison Pullis. I'm the director of the Harlan Lincoln House, and I'm thrilled that you're here tonight, so thank you so much for coming out. I'll just speak briefly, and I'm here to introduce Iowa Wesleyan's President, Christine Plunkett. Thank you.
Good evening. I am delighted to see you all here. Thank you for coming. We are so excited tonight to welcome back C.J. King. She's a very dear friend of Iowa Wesleyan University and the Friends of the Harlan Lincoln House. I have really enjoyed meeting her and getting to know her. We quickly bonded over our shared love of both Vermont and Iowa. We spoke of our unique attachments to these two distinct landscapes, the blazing red and gold mountains of Vermont in the fall and the stunningly beautiful wide open skies of Iowa. So it is my pleasure to provide the introductory remarks for her appearance tonight. Mary Harlan Lincoln was the eldest child of James and Anna Harlan and spent a great deal of her life in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Mary even attended some preparatory classes at Iowa Wesleyan University, then Iowa Wesleyan College, when she was a little girl, long before meeting and marrying Robert Todd Lincoln, the eldest child of Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln. The Harlan Lincolns would spend summers here in Mount Pleasant, and eventually the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of the Harlan and Lincoln families could be spotted playing on the porch of a certain yellow house. Today, the Harlan Lincoln House stands as a legacy of this extraordinary family heritage. A native of Indiana, C.J. King was in graduate school when she discovered her connection to the Harlan and Lincoln families. Through genealogical research completed by her great-aunt, Helen Harlan, C.J. learned that Mary Harlan Lincoln was a second cousin to her great-great-grandfather. This family link prompted C.J. to complete a tour of the Lincoln estate in Vermont, and that tour sparked a desire to know more about the women in the families, through one woman in particular. In C.J.'s words, I wanted to know more about Peggy, who was a farmer, a pilot, an artist, and more. My mother suggested I do some research, and the result of that research is this book. The book was titled Four Marys and a Jessie, the story of the Lincoln women, and encompasses the lives of the Lincoln and Harlan women, beginning with Mary Todd Lincoln and ending with Peggy Beckwith, the great-granddaughter of Abraham Lincoln. Writing the book took over a decade of research and work, and C.J. visited historical societies, libraries, museums, universities, and communities in the states of Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Massachusetts, and Vermont. The culmination of C.J.'s hard work produced a book that highlighted the lives of the Lincoln women, not in an effort to glorify them because of their connection to Abraham Lincoln, but to give these women their own place in history and to celebrate them as individuals. Following C.J.'s initial visit to Vermont and introduction to the Harlan Lincoln women, she moved to Jamaica, Vermont, where she currently resides. In addition to holding a Bachelor of Arts degree in journalism from Ball State University, C.J. earned a Master's of Fine Arts in Writing from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. As a professional writer for over 40 years, C.J. has published many articles in newspapers and magazines. Four Marys and a Jessie is her first book, and C.J. has continued to travel the United States sharing her research on the Harlan and Lincoln families. You'll have an opportunity to meet with C.J. and purchase her book in the social hall following this presentation. But now please join me in welcoming C.J. King, who will be presenting as Peggy Beckwith, to the stage.
Goodness, you've all come to hear my Lincoln stories? I hope you'll find them interesting, and not just because we're Lincolns. If we weren't Lincolns, I don't think anybody would pay any attention to us at all. And you know what? That will be just fine with me. I'm glad to be back in Iowa. I was born here. Did you know that? Any of you born here in Iowa? Well, I was born right here in Mount Pleasant on August 22nd, 1898. That was a long time ago. So it's great to be back in Iowa. We moved away when I was quite young. My great-grandfather Harlan died when I was just a year old. And my great-grandmother Harlan was already gone, so I didn't really know them. My grandmother inherited the house, and so we came back and we visited sometimes. It's great to be back in Iowa. Well, did you know that Harlan Lincoln House is available for tours? It's right on the edge of the campus. Of course, for me, it's a little bit different because when I go in there, it's just memories of us walking around in there being at home. It was like that also at Hildene in Vermont. It was just our family home. Of course, eventually I inherited Hildene, so it really was my home. But you know, you didn't come here so I could ramble on about houses, so the nice folks who brought me here asked me to talk to you about the Harlan Lincoln women. So let me take off my hat and my coat and let's get started. I must tell you that when CJ invited me to come out here, to fly out here and be with you, I was kind of reluctant because I never really wanted to be in the limelight. But as you can see, I agreed, and so here I am. Four Marys and a Jessie, the Harlan Lincoln women. Well, yeah, I know this talk was introduced to you as the spirited Lincoln women. And CJ's book about us is called Four Marys and a Jessie, the Lincoln Women. But here we are in Iowa, and in Iowa, Harlan is important. So, by the way, those of you who are colonial dames out there, if any of you are here, that Harlan heritage is also important to you. Because the Harlans that CJ and I are descended from they were George and Elizabeth Duck Harlan, and they came here in 1687. They came to the Pennsylvania colony, Chester County, and George Harlan was the provincial governor and a member of the colonial assembly. So the colonial dames folks in Vermont tell us that we would qualify for membership, and any Harlans descended from George. I thought you might like to know that. So, as the title suggests here, there are four Marys and a Jessie, and of course that can be kind of confusing, because which Mary Lincoln are you talking about? So first I'd like to introduce them to you one by one. As you can see up here, all five of us are pictured. At the top left is my great-grandmother, Mary Todd Lincoln, wife of the president. To her right is my grandmother, Mary Harlan Lincoln, daughter of Senator and Anne Eliza Harlan. And the bottom left is my Aunt Mamie, the oldest of the three children. In the middle is my mother, Jessie, and I bet you can guess it. That's me on the right. So, as I've thought about my memories of my family and wanting to introduce them to you, two central themes have emerged that I wanted to talk to you about today. First of all, as the president said, I wanted you to know something about the individual spirited personalities of these folks. And also, I wanted to tell you a little bit about our spiritual lives. So the first Mary is Mary Todd Lincoln. As I mentioned, she's my great-grandmother, and she was the wife of Abraham Lincoln. Now, I never met this woman, so everything I know about her was told to me either by my grandparents, and they didn't really like to talk about her too much. So I also learned things from what I could read and people ask also gave me some clues. Plus, CJ has provided me with a few facts. So Mary Todd was born on December 13, 1818 in Lexington, Kentucky. She was the fourth child. Now, in contrast to her husband's hardscrabble roots, her family was quite comfortable. Her father was a merchant, family members were well educated and prominent, and they were influential members of their society. Like her future husband, she lost her mother at a young age. Mary was just 6 years old when her mother died of childbirth. As you can imagine, Mary's father married again. There were 6 children by then, and you would expect that he would want another wife to help him raise them. So Mary's father and her stepmother, Betsy Humphreys, had 8 more children. So in all, there were 14 Todd children. As the family expanded, they moved down the house from Mary's birthplace, pictured at the top here, to this beautiful brick home at the bottom, and that home is also open for tours. We know a great deal about Mary Todd because the book was written about her by her half-sister's daughter, Catherine Helm. This book has an abundance of first-hand stories about the family. I love this picture that Catherine Helm painted of my great-great-grandmother. And I also like the way she described Mary Todd as a playful, inventive, and tomboy-type girl. You can imagine that I would like that. Mary loved to romp around with her boy and girl cousins, playing lively games. Mary's temperament could quickly turn into an emotional storm. It seems that Mary's moods tended towards extremes. Most often she was sweet and generous, but she was quick to strike back when she thought she'd been wronged. And at these moments, her temper was like a sudden summer lightning storm, full of fury, blowing over quickly, and then filling her with remorse. Catherine Helm quotes a cousin, Margaret Stewart, as saying, Mary's temperament was much like an April day, sunning all over with laughter one moment and the next crying as though her heart would break. Mary Todd had a natural interest in politics. She followed the events of the day quite closely, and she had strong opinions. Mary grew up in a politically minded family. Her father served in the state legislature and was a good friend of the Congressman Henry Clay, who had been Speaker of the House and also was Secretary of State for John Quincy Adams. This mutual interest drew Abraham and Mary together. While they were courting, they were avidly following the presidential campaigns of William Henry Harrison and Martin Van Buren. And Mary told her friend Mercy, I became quite a politician, a very unladylike profession. Harrison won, much to the delight and relief of Mary and Abraham. So Abraham and Mary were well matched. They both had an abundance of natural intelligence. They had an interest in politics. They were politically astute. They liked poetry and romanticism. They were married in November of 1842. Now, Mary had expressed her ambitions even as a young child. She once said to Henry Clay that she thought her father was rather odd because he did not wish to be president. With Abraham Lincoln, she was able to achieve the highest level available to her in society, that of First Lady. She was also quite an asset to her husband as First Lady. When Abraham Lincoln was first nominated by the Republican Party, a New York Evening Post reporter wrote, quote, whatever of awkwardness may be ascribed to her husband, there is none of that in her. She converses with freedom and grace and is thoroughly au fait in all the little amenities of society. It was true that Abraham could be socially awkward, mainly because he didn't care about those niceties. So Mary Todd Lincoln compensated. It was important because Washington high society considered the couple to be outsiders, uncouth and simple-minded because they were from the western frontier states of Kentucky and Illinois. So Mary craved respect for her husband and herself and did what she could to change opinions. The biographer Ruth Painter Randall provides us with a long and excellent description of Mary Todd Lincoln's assets as First Lady. She wrote, Mary brought to her position as White House hostess fine qualifications, the birth and reading of a gentlewoman, an excellent cultural education, a bright, quick, and responsive mind, the charm of a vital and joyous personality, a conscientious desire to help her husband by fulfilling her duties, and the love of social life that stems from a genuine interest in people, that she was not acquainted with the superficial sophistications of Washington society was of concern only to that society itself. However, that society was extremely vocal. But Mary had the fortitude required for standing in line to greet an endless chain of people and to be gracious and interested in each one. She could sit through a 4-hour dinner of notables, stiff with their own dignity, meeting unexpected contingencies with composure, and being careful to not neglect any guest. On the other hand, her temper got her into trouble. As First Lady, she had strong convictions, and she was used to frank discussions with her husband about politics. But in the hotbed atmosphere of the Civil War White House, Abraham turned more and more to his cabinet for advice. So when Mary did express her opinion and try to influence events or lobby for something, the men surrounding her considered this to be unwanted interference. So Mary turned her attention to redecorating the White House. She believed that in restoring the White House to grandeur, she could help her husband and also build national pride. This was a natural endeavor, expected of a First Lady, with a budget included in the national budget. It was, after all, a woman's role to create a stable home, and she intended to do this to the best of her ability. Now, Mary's taste was exquisite, and she wanted the finest of everything. When the project went over budget, she was criticized by the press and in Congress. Her extravagance was seen as distasteful in a time of war. Even her husband criticized her for buying too many flub dubs when the soldiers needed blankets and food. This criticism shadowed her for the rest of her life. She was very sensitive to criticism and sometimes lost her temper when she was trying to defend herself. Mary was also criticized for her family connections to the rebels. She had half-brothers, brothers, and brothers-in-law fighting for the Confederacy. This fact opened to her to constant criticism and also charges that maybe she was an enemy sympathizer or a Southern spy. But Mary was not responsible for this political inferno. Neither was she responsible for the circumstances of her birth. She wasn't responsible that she was born in a border state. She couldn't help it that her father owned slaves. She didn't choose for her family members to fight for the Confederacy. These facts put her in a vulnerable position, and so she was afraid to grieve openly when family members died. At the time of the Battle of Shiloh, a pastor friend was visiting Reverend Noyes Minor, and everyone was tense waiting for news of the battle. Mary bitterly said that she hoped her brothers would be captured or killed. And when Reverend Minor registered surprise, she responded that they would kill my husband or destroy our government, the dearest of all things to us. She was adamantly loyal to her husband and to her country. But still, her heart did grieve when her brothers died. She lost a half-brother at Shiloh and another half-brother at Vicksburg. and a brother-in-law at Chickamauga. It's hard to argue that any First Lady lived during more trying circumstances. No other First Lady lived during flaming inferno of a civil war, and during constant threat of attack and battles being fought right across the river. On the other hand, I want to point out that Mary was very motherly and tender towards those she trusted. Did you know that she sometimes went to the hospitals to visit the wounded soldiers, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week? These are the sweetest stories, and everyone has forgotten them. So I want you to remember. She spent hours and hours visiting the soldiers. She read to them, she talked to them, she asked about their lives, their families, their sweethearts, anything to distract them from their pains. She helped them write letters home. Here's an example that she wrote to the mother of a soldier named James Agan. She wrote, "I'm sitting by the side of your soldier boy. He has been quite sick, but he's getting well. He tells me to say to you that he is all right." She did not tell the young soldier her name, but did he know who she was? We don't know. But she signed the letter with respect to the mother of the young soldier, Mrs. Abraham Lincoln. Now, Mary's White House secretary encouraged her to take reporters with her on these visits to promote her actions, but she refused. Stoddard later wrote, "She rarely takes outside company with her on these errands and thereby loses opportunities. If she were worldly wise, she would carry newspaper correspondence, 2 to 5 of both sexes, and every time she went, she would have them take shorthand notes of what she said to the soldiers and what they said back to her. And after that, she would bring the writers back to the White House, serve them cake and coffee, and have them tour the conservatory." Now, I admire my great-grandmother's refusal to capitalize on these missions of mercy. But perhaps Stoddard was right. If she had taken reporters with her and gotten more attention for this aspect of herself, perhaps history would be kinder to her. Now, the first 2 Marys, Mary Todd Lincoln and Mary Harlan, became appointed during the Civil War. They were both in D.C. Mary's father, Senator James Harlan, ended up on the second cabinet of Lincoln, and the families were quite friendly with each other. Mary Harlan, in fact, was Robert's date to the second inaugural ball. The 2 Marys had a lot in common. They had similar upbringings. They had fathers who supported education for women. In fact, Senator Harlan chose his wife, Anne Eliza Peck, because of her intelligence. He had been her tutor in Greencastle, Indiana, when she attended Miss Larrabee's school, and he was at Indiana Asbury, now DePaul University. And he wrote in his diary that he formed a very flattering opinion of her capacity. So after James and Anne Eliza married, he was president of 2 Iowa colleges. First Iowa City College, and then later Mount Pleasant Collegiate Institute. As you know, now Iowa Wesleyan. Mary attended Mount Collegiate Institute for her prep school education. One classmate said she could play the harp divinely. Mary's schooling was sporadic because they went back and forth from Iowa to D.C. During the time she was in D.C., she also attended Madam Smith's French School, and she also later enrolled in a few sessions at Iowa Wesleyan as a college student, but she didn't graduate. Now, Mary Harlan was just the sort of mate that Mary Todd Lincoln wanted for her son, and she did whatever she could to bring them together. But the match was not certain for several years. It seems that my grandmother had an abundance of suitors. Her friend Minnie Chandler liked to tease her about this, and one time wrote, "How many are you engaged to now, 10 or a dozen?" By the summer of 1868, the question was settled. Robert and Mary were married in September September of 1868. Robert was a graduate of Harvard and had a law degree from the University of Chicago, and they settled in Chicago and he began to practice law. Former Iowa Wesleyan President Louis Hasselmeyer once wrote that after her marriage, Mary Harlan Lincoln's life was one of complete involvement in family affairs. He said her life is shadowy and almost without independence of her own. Well, it's true that Granny followed the traditional role as wife of Robert and mother of her children. It's true that, unlike Mary Todd Lincoln, she did not crave attention. But let me tell you, when she put her foot down, she was a force to be contended with. For example, I gave up flying because it bothered her so much. So please don't tell her I flew out here today. The relationship between Mary Todd Lincoln and Mary Harlan Lincoln started out quite well, very happy and congenial. But over time, the battle of wills took its toll. There's so much I could tell you about this, but if I go off on that track, I'll never get back. You can read more about it in our biography. My grandparents' home was quite happy in the early years. 3 children were born. First Mamie, officially Mary Lincoln, born October 15 in 1869. Then Jack, officially Abraham Lincoln II, born August 14, 1873. And finally Jessie, on November 6, 1875. Parenting these small children was a joy. Robert told his friend John Hay that Mamie and Jack were such small steam engines and such a circus we had every night. Later, when he heard that John Hay had a newborn daughter, he told a mutual friend, "My experience with girl babies makes me envy him. They are very nice." Robert and Mary's 3 children were very happy and popular. The other kids liked them for their kindness, their liveliness, and their lack of pretension. They had no strong connection to their famous grandparents. Abraham had been assassinated years before they were born, and their grandmother, Lincoln, lived in Europe most of the time during their childhood. Mamie was probably the only one who could really remember grandmother Lincoln, and that's when she was old and ill. On the other hand, they knew their Harlan grandparents quite well. They spent many summers visiting here in Mount Pleasant. Grandfather Harlan marked their heights on a door as they grew, and Mamie and Grandfather Harlan took long walks together, arm in arm, talking about their lives and the books they were reading. Once Mamie was asked about her special connection to Abraham Lincoln. She replied, "Yes, but it means so much to live with Grandfather Harlan." There was a mutual admiration there because Grandfather Harlan described his granddaughter as a good armful of lively girlhood. The Harlan Lincoln grandchildren were well connected in Mount Pleasant society. Mamie and Jessie both were inducted into the PEO Sisterhood here in Mount Pleasant. Mamie in 1884 and Jessie in 1895. The Mount Pleasant sculptress, Harriet Ketchum, asked Mamie and 2 other local girls to serve as models as she designed her proposal for the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Des Moines. Her design won, but she died before the project was complete. Mamie and Jessie were invited to numerous social gatherings, parties, picnics, costume balls, to name a few. They rode around town on their pony, and a childhood friend said, "We knew them and we liked them because they were just one of the crowd." I love to hear these stories about their happy times in Mount Pleasant. Now, on the other hand, being a Lincoln did come with some privileges. They had an opportunity to meet royalty while their father, Robert, was ambassador to Great Britain. My mother used her Lincoln connection one time in order to meet the Prince of Wales. The Lincolns were attending a crowded reception at the Foreign Office, and Prince Edward was also there. So Jessie boldly walked up to Madame Waddington, the French ambassador's wife, and said that she would like an introduction. Madame Waddington was skeptical. She didn't know that he would agree because he wasn't feeling well. But as soon as he learned that the granddaughter of Abraham Lincoln wanted to meet him, he immediately got up and went to her. They talked for a little while, and then in closing he said, "You might like to meet some of the other guests and take a tour." She looked right into his blue eyes and said, "Thank you very much, but I only wanted to meet the Prince of Wales, and now that I have talked to you, I don't want anything more." The Lincolns' time in London was not always happy. Tragedy struck while they were there. Jack, their son, was sent to a school in France in part of his preparation for studying law and joining the father's law firm. But Jack contracted blood poisoning when a series of boils under his arm got infected. The illness lasted for several months with his condition fluctuating, but finally he succumbed in March of 1890. My grandfather, Robert, wrote, "It was the hardest of many hard things." Doesn't that just break your heart? I think about it. He had lost all three of his brothers. His father was assassinated. He had to deal with his mother's mental illness and her eventual death, and now the loss of his one and only son. He told his friend John Hay, "I did not realize until he was gone how deeply my thoughts of the future were in him." Grandpa's added a comment that illustrates my grandmother's strength. He wrote, "My wife has surprised all of us by not breaking down. I would not have believed that any person could have stood the restraint of all these months as she did with apparent cheerfulness, even when she had no hope." Jack was buried in his famous namesake's grave at the Lincoln Monument in Springfield, Illinois. Now, as difficult as it was, life went on. My grandfather, Robert, returned to his duties as ambassador 2 months after the burial. Granny, Aunt Mamie, and my mom stayed here in Mount Pleasant for about 6 months and then returned to London. It was said that Granny could not attend the burial because she was in delicate health. So finally, her cheerful demeanor had broken down. For Aunt Mamie, the return to London must have been bittersweet. Probably she could still hear Jack's voice telling her stories about the iconic buildings, and that made her miss him even more. On the other hand, there was the sweet balm of her upcoming nuptials. Her engagement to Charles Isham, the secretary with the American Ministry in England, was announced in July, and their picture-perfect wedding took place in September of 1891 in the Brompton Parish Church of the Holy Trinity. Charles was 16 years her senior, but Mamie was said to be very mature. The report of the wedding in the Mount Pleasant paper said, "Mary, the eldest, with her rare and lovable qualities and sterling qualities of character, has many devoted friends who will no doubt feel Charles Isham must be as pure and brave as Sir Galahad himself to be worthy of such a maiden's heart and hand." Mamie and Charles enjoyed a comfortable life. He worked for his father's bank in New York. They enjoyed art exhibits, music, and plays. They had a second home in the center of Manchester Village, not far from Hildene. Charles loved gardening. They had one son, and they named him Lincoln Isham. He's pictured here with his mother. Link was my only first cousin, and he's older than me by about 6 years. As an adult, Link and his wife, Leah, settled in Dorset, Vermont. Link was very involved in the Southern Vermont Art Center in Manchester, and Link and my brother, Bud, and I had many happy times together. But that's another story, and of course I can't tell you everything in 1 hour. Now, while my Aunt Mamie lived a quiet and conventional life, my my mother Jessie took another route. The story of my mother's wedding, the first one, was quite different from Mamie's storybook tale. My parents eloped. Now, when my grandparents learned that my mother and Warren Beckwith intended to marry, they did everything they could to stop it. The Beckwiths and my grandparents were good friends. The Beckwiths were well-respected members of the Mount Pleasant community. That wasn't it. But my father intended to make a living as a professional baseball player. And my grandfather did not think that was a suitable life for his daughter. So the Milwaukee Journal described my father as a harum-scarum youth, devoted to athletics, a good horseman and shot and bicyclist, but with a decided aversion to educational matters. I'm sympathetic both ways. You know, my grandparents were just trying to look out for the best long-term interests of their daughter. But my father, I could understand how he didn't want to be locked into a conventional career when his talents were elsewhere. Grandpa and Granny tried their best to keep my parents apart. They whisked my mother off to Chicago, thinking that the distance would prevent the marriage. It didn't. They just made their plans by writing letters back and forth to mutual friends. They met at the Chicago railway station on November 10th in 1897 and took the train to Milwaukee. There, Reverend O.P. Christian agreed to perform the ceremony. They were of age, they had the proper documents, they seemed determined to be wed. They returned to Chicago the next day and went their separate ways without telling anyone they had married. Somehow my grandparents found out, and my grandfather sent his newlywed daughter confined in a room. The newspapers described it like a princess locked in a castle. Eventually, they reunited, but during that time, the scandalous publicity and the forced separation ran in the papers for weeks. No doubt many people found this family-sized civil war quite amusing. The Mount Pleasant Daily News wrote, "It's been a long time since anything has stirred the social sea in Mount Pleasant to such depths." You can understand my grandfather's embarrassment. As Abraham Lincoln's son, he tried in all ways to be most proper. And the very day that the elopement hit the newspaper, he was due to be named president of the Pullman Palace Car Company, the pinnacle of his career. There must have been people who wondered how he was going to manage this prestigious business when he couldn't even control his daughter. Again, I sympathized. My grandfather with all the burden of being Abraham Lincoln's son, trying so hard not to tarnish the Lincoln name. And yet my spirited mother, how was she to deny her heart? I was born almost exactly 9 months later on August 22nd in 1898. I know, it was a cute baby, so adorable. But really, did they have to dress me up like this? I want to ask you, look at me standing up here, and which of these pictures do you think looks more like the real Eddie? If you want me to look natural, you need to pose me with one of my pets. See, here's another example, an older me with one of my dogs. The other picture is of me, my mother, and my brother Bud. Later we called him Bob. Officially, he was Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, born July 19, 1904. So we all had Lincoln somewhere in our name, even if it wasn't our surname. This cute schoolgirl look was one that my mother really liked. She was the fashion queen. But I'm much more comfortable like this. I mean, you can't wear a dress going hunting or fixing the car or flying an airplane. Well, maybe you can, but it sure didn't suit me. Like my dad, I like to be physically active, working on the farm, feeding the livestock, stirring maple syrup over an open fire, hiking, swimming in the Battenkill, fishing. Yes, the outdoor life in Iowa and in Vermont suited me much better than the city life of DC. That's my airplane, my Gypsy Moth, on the day I did my Lincoln duty and flew over a car parade that was celebrating the opening of the Ethan Allen Highway. It's now called Vermont Route 7. That was September 20th, 1930. The two of us pictured here are great-grandchildren of someone famous. That's Ethan Allen IV on the left, and me, the fourth Mary. I spent a lot of time introducing us, the four Marys and a Jessie, but I also promised to talk to you about our spiritual lives. I feel a little bit defensive about this part of my talk because, you know, there's that old advice about religion not being good discussion for polite company. And also because the religions I'm going to discuss are more controversial than most. Of all the things I can say today, these may be the most personal. You cannot fully express who God is and what your religious feelings are. It's something I've never really put into words. Despite the many, many books that have been written about God and religion, including those by Mary Baker Eddy, there's really no good language that completely tells this topic. God's divine mind is much bigger than any of our human minds can comprehend. We're just too limited to express it all. It's like that verse in Corinthians that says, we see through a glass darkly. I tried to live the aspects of the Christian Science life that were most important to me, but what I say today cannot be the whole story. First, I want to tell you about Mary Todd Lincoln and spiritualism. It may be that personal tragedy is one of the strongest motivators for having a spiritual connection. And Mary Todd Lincoln endured more tragedies than many. Her mother died when she was 6. Her stepmother did not show her any particular love. As a young mother, she had 3 losses in rapid succession. First her father in the summer of 1849, and then her dear grandmother Parker in January of 1850, and just a month later, her second-born son Eddie, who was just short of 4 years old. Then the Civil War brought another string of tragedies. They lost friends and relatives, and then her third-born son Willie died in February of 1862 at the age of 11. And then, just when the war was over, just days after the signing of the treaty at Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Just that morning, over breakfast, Abraham had told his son Robert, I trust that an era of good feeling has returned, and that henceforth we shall live in harmony together. While across town, John Wilkes Booth was plotting his demise. From the moment of her husband's death for the next 21 years, Mary Todd Lincoln was constantly in mourning. She always dressed in black for the rest of her life. She moved on through life, but her heart and her spirit never recovered. These words from biographer Ruth Painter Randall describe Mary's broken spirit. Truly, the whole world was in grief when Abraham Lincoln died, but the distilled essence of the great agony was in the heart of the sick and broken widow. She too had received a wound that was fatal, though it would be long years before she could die. 2 lives crashed that day. Lincoln's struggle was soon over, his mystic ship safe in harbor. It was Mary's ship, crippled, that must sail on and on. 6 years later, in the summer of 1871, Mary's youngest son, Tad, died of pleurisy, a bacterial infection that filled his lungs with fluid. Now, grief is a powerful emotion, as you no doubt know. Some people find their way through it, and some don't. Mary's behavior became so erratic that Robert felt compelled to commit his mother to an asylum. She spent almost a year in Bellevue near Chicago, causing a deep rift between the mother and son that took many years to heal. Some people blame my grandfather. Some people blame Mary Todd Lincoln. But what good is it to blame? It was tragic all the way around. To deal with her grief through the years, my great-grandmother turned to spiritualism, which believed that it was possible to contact the spirits of those who had passed over and that these spirits might be able to offer useful advice and guidance. Mary first turned to spiritualism after the death of Willie. She attended many seances over the years and even held a few in the White House. She was comforted by the visions and messages that she received that her sons and her husband had safely crossed over to a new spirit life. There's nothing crazy about this desire for reassurance. Many of us turn to our spiritual connection for the reassurance that our loved ones live on. And spiritualism was not just some kooky fringe movement. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people turned to spiritualism in the 19th century, especially during the Civil War when so many families were in grief. Respectable people like Gideon Welles, Lincoln's Secretary of War, and his wife, Mary Jane, along with Queen Victoria and the French Empress Eugenie. My great-grandmother particularly respected the European royalty and saw herself in that same role in America. So their endorsement was enough for her. I know that today opinion is quite divided still about whether it's possible to communicate with the dead. Now, I can't vouch for the truth of my great-grandmother's claims, but I know she was deeply comforted, and that's no small matter. She told her sister that Willie lives. He comes to me every night and stands at the foot of the bed with that same sweet, adoring smile. He does not always come alone. Sometimes little Eddie is with him. We think this spooky photo of my great-grandmother and her husband's spirit was the last one taken of her. It's not really flattering, but Mary Todd Lincoln treasured this picture as a reminder of a particular seance when she felt her husband's presence in this way. The Boston spirit photographer William Mumler superimposed the ghostly image into this photo to memorialize the experience. I certainly understand how such experiences could help you go on, so I pass no judgment on my great-grandmother or on the hundreds and thousands of other people who turn to spiritualism for reassurance. For the rest of the four Marys and my mother Jessie, it was the teachings of another Mary. I'm going to tell you how this connection began. My fellow Harlan Lincoln women were already followers of Christian Science when I was born. It was just part of the fabric of the family. Some say that Granny, Aunt Mamie, and my mother turned to Christian Science because conventional medicine had failed to save the life of Jack. I hate to think how hard it was for them to sit by his bedside month after month and watch him fail. Today, a simple dose of penicillin would have cured him. Jack died in March of 1890, and penicillin wasn't discovered until 1928. It's possible, however, that my grandmother's first introduction to Christian Science began years before that. A Christian Science historian told CJ that my grandmother was active in the Christian Science Church in Chicago in the mid-1880s and probably met Mary Baker Eddy, the founder there, when she taught in 1884 and 1885. We also think that Mary Harlan Lincoln's maternal aunts in Greencastle, Indiana, were Christian Scientists, and we're still trying to track down more information about this. You know, Christianity originally contained the message of healing as well as spiritual restoration. Christian Science understands that God is infinite good, infinite love, so good and so powerful that if you just catch a glimpse of it, you can be healed. My Aunt Mamie was the first to officially join the Christian Science Church. She did so in 1897, followed by my grandmother a year later. Granny and Aunt Mamie attended one of the church's annual meetings in Boston and had fond memories of this. My granny remembered this vividly in a letter to her practitioner, Mr. Arthur Hitchcock, writing, "I shall never forget it." The rest of us studied Christian Science and corresponded with practitioners occasionally, but we didn't join the church. My brother did take classes in DC with Mr. Hitchcock, and cousin Link sometimes corresponded with Mr. Hitchcock. If Aunt Mamie corresponded with Mr. Hitchcock or another practitioner, we just don't have a record of it. Most of the evidence of the Christian Science connection comes from my grandmother's correspondence with Mr. Hitchcock. Granny didn't show me these letters. Their correspondence was private. But a collection of these letters surfaced a few years ago and were donated to the Lincoln Library in Springfield, Illinois. CJ has read them all, and she has provided me with some notes to share. The correspondence spans more than a decade, from 1924 to 1936, the year before my grandmother died. Hitchcock was a well-established Christian Science practitioner. If he had another source of income, I don't know about it, but we have receipts showing that my grandmother paid him $50 a month. Might not sound like very much, but when you look at those inflation calculators, you'll see that in 1931, $50 would equal about $800 today. Granny also subscribed to some Christian Science publications over the years, and to strengthen her spiritual resolve, she sometimes copied out passages like this. Mary Baker Eddy often described malicious animal magnetism as the opposite of the divine mind. And so my grandmother wrote out these words: "Arouse yourself to a clear sense of purpose and God's power. Animal magnetism, ignorant or malicious, you cannot deprive me of intelligence, truth, or love. You cannot separate me from God." Granny often wrote to Mr. Hitchcock about her ailments, but she also told him about family dynamics. She worried about the relationship between her daughters. On the surface, Mamie and my mother were polite, but as sisters, they sometimes did not get along. In May of 1926, we have a letter showing that Granny wrote to Mr. Hitchcock that, quote, "Mrs. Johnson," that's my mother, her second marriage, "has made no gesture of friendship to her sister, although many overtures have been made by Mrs. Isham." Honestly, I don't have a recollection of this particular rift, but it wasn't unusual for them to be at odds. Their personalities were so different. Mamie was so prim and proper in her behavior, and Jessie, such a free spirit. The first record we have of my mother's interest in Christian Science is this letter she wrote from London to her grandfather, Harlan. It was 1891. And Jessie writes saying that Captain Lincoln is coming to talk to us about the ists and isms of CS, so that we may be able to answer questions more clearly. Among those who would be attending would be Mrs. General Dodge and her daughter Annie, Miss Brown, Miss Thompson, Miss L, Mama and myself, and probably our governess, Miss Shales, who was very much interested in Christian Science. Now, Captain L was Captain John Linscott of DC, a member of the Christian Science Board of Lectureship. He was also a Civil War veteran, wounded in battle, but he recovered. He became interested in Christian Science in 1886, took classes with Mrs. Eddy in 1887, and became a sort of missionary, traveling on a lecture circuit, and he established 13 Christian Science churches in London and in the United States. Miss Brown, Miss Thompson, and Miss Shales I can't identify. But I do know that the Dodges in my family were great friends. General Grenville Dodge, Annie's father, was also a Civil War veteran, an acquaintance of Abraham Lincoln. My mother and Annie remained close friends. Years later, after this lecture, Annie Dodge wrote to my mother, trying to persuade her to reunite with my father. But it was too late. She was already ready to marry Frank Johnson. Annie Dodge's testimonial is published on the Christian Science website. She says that in just one treatment, Mary Baker Eddy cured her of anemia. Now, there are notes in my mother's copy of Mary Baker Eddy's Science and Health that indicate my mother left Christian Science for a while and then came back. She lists passages where she said, "This is the reason I left science in 1895." And she has other passages where she says, "This is why I came back." Now, most of my family members wrote to Mr. Hitchcock when they wanted a Christian Science practitioner. But of course, my mother had to do something different. She corresponded with Ruth Burton. I can't tell you a whole lot about my mother's letter to her because I haven't seen them, but I've seen a couple of Mrs. Burton's replies. So this shows one of the quotes that Mrs. Burton gave, of the advice Mrs. Burton gave to my mother. It says, "If we really know that all that comes to us or goes from us comes from mind," meaning God, "then the effect or sign following has to be good." Christian Science always promoted an optimistic frame of mind. Here's another passage from Mrs. Burton that encourages a contemplative approach to life. She writes, "Rest for the people of God is in the conscious knowing and practice principle. There's nothing outside of that perfect principle." Well, restfulness was not really a way of life that my mother ever perfected. She was always restless, including in her marriages. My parents divorced when I was about 10 years old, but they hadn't lived together for years. I never really got to know my father. And then my mother married Frank Johnson, and that marriage lasted for about 10 years, and then they divorced. Then she married Mr. Randolph. Well, maybe third time's a charm, because that marriage lasted for 22 years until my mother's death in 1948. Mr. Randolph outlived her by about 4 years. Now, this shows that my mother sometimes discussed my issues with Mrs. Burton, as this comment proves. Mrs. Burton writes back, "I hope that Peggy is finding she is a complete idea today. Hands, feet, and all the gadgets in between, and never be anything. Knowing is being, and knowing is spiritual." I don't know what I was doing that encouraged my mother to write and for Mrs. Burton to respond, but there you have it. Now you come to me. As hard as embarrassing as it is to talk about the rest of the Lincoln Limmer, it's even harder to talk about myself. You know, I can hardly believe I was persuaded to come here today and to talk openly about my family members. Believe me, it was a personal favor to C.J. King, who's always tried to be so fair about us. Most people, most historians, it seems, are looking for faults in us as Lincolns. C.J. tries to give a balanced picture. She's dug up lots of other information that we couldn't include in today's presentation, and frankly, some of it I just don't want to talk about. I will tell you this. I found most of my spiritual connection in the outdoors. Although I never joined the Christian Science Church officially, I did sometimes avail myself by writing to Mr. Hitchcock, as this letter shows. I once wrote to him for help with a persistent cough. Oops. Oh, what happened there? There we go. With this letter, I say, "I have been struggling with a bad cold and cough for a week, and it's not without much success." I think it's that cigarette I'm holding that's causing the problem. We all smoked back then. We didn't think anything about it. There were other letters back and forth between me and Mr. Hitchcock, but they were quite personal, and I choose not to talk about them. It's bad enough being in Lincoln without everyone knowing all of your business. There's so much I could tell you about my wonderful family, but I think I've taken enough of your time. So I hope the stories that I've told you today will leave you with a lasting impression. We were just ordinary people. None of us chose to be Lincolns. Well, I guess great-grandmother and my mother did. My grandmother did. Mary Todd Lincoln married Abraham because she found in him a kindred spirit and someone of great promise. And my grandmother chose Robert for similar reasons, and knowing that he would have great pressure as the son of Abraham, she willingly chose to be his helpmate. The rest of us were born in this family by no choice of our own. People always ask me, what's it like to be the great-granddaughter of Abraham Lincoln? And I just say to them, I'm as far away from him as anyone. I never knew him. It's just my luck he's related to me. We managed our heritage as best we could, tried to be the best people we could, and lived our own lives. Yes, we had privileges, but day by day we had the same worries as anyone. We had the same longing to be our best and to connect with God. For most people, it's the Lincoln part of our heritage that makes us interesting to them. We really cherished those friends who forgot about all of that and just thought about us for our own individual selves. I'm hoping that after telling you these stories, that you will also think of us that way. Thank you very much for your attention. Or say anything else? I've told you a lot of stories already. It's a lot to percolate. No? Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate sharing the opportunity to come to Iowa and share all of this with you, and hope that you will cherish these stories.